The sun cast a golden glow over the sprawling estate, its manicured gardens stretching toward the valley below. The mansion stood tall, a symbol of unimaginable wealth, its towering windows reflecting the quiet afternoon. Inside, the air was filled with laughter and conversation, staff moving efficiently through the halls, a few guests enjoying the luxury that surrounded them. Among them was a 9-year-old black boy, visiting as a friend of the billionaire's daughter. He wasn't from this world of privilege, but the girl had invited him over, insisting that he join her for the day. Though he felt a little out of place, he had always been taught to carry himself with confidence, no matter where he was. Then everything changed. A sudden scream echoed from the second floor. Thick smoke billowed through the hallways, curling under doors and climbing up the walls. A fire had erupted in one of the rooms, the flames spreading rapidly. Within moments, panic broke out. Staff ran in every direction. Guests rushed to evacuate, and the billionaire's wife shouted for someone to find her daughter. The boy's breath hitched. He turned toward the hallway and saw her. The billionaire's daughter stood frozen at the top of the stairs, smoke swirling around her. Fear was etched into her face as she coughed violently, struggling to see through the thick haze. The fire was growing, blocking her path to safety. His feet moved before his mind could think. Ducking past panicked servants, he sprinted toward the stairs. The heat was unbearable, the smoke stinging his eyes, but he didn't stop. He reached her just as a fiery beam cracked above them, sending embers cascading around their feet. She whimpered, her small hands gripping his arm in terror. "It's okay," he reassured her, voice steady despite the fear gripping his own heart. "We're getting out of here." He pulled her close, shielding her body with his own as he maneuvered through the smoke. Every breath felt like fire in his lungs, but he refused to let go of her. Then, with one final push, they burst through the front doors. Cool air rushed over them. The girl gasped for breath, her small frame shaking against him as they stumbled onto the lawn. For a moment, everything was still. Then, whispers. He barely had time to process what had happened before the murmurs started. The mansion staff, some guests, and even a few security personnel exchanged uneasy glances. The boy, still panting from the smoke, noticed the wary looks thrown in his direction. Someone spoke. Low, cautious, but enough to spread. How did he know she was in there? Another voice. Was he really trying to help, or did he have something to do with it? The boy's stomach tightened. Even after risking his life, even after dragging her from the fire, they still saw him as a suspect. He glanced at the girl, who clung to him, unaware of the accusations already forming. Then, a new voice cut through the crowd, a powerful, commanding voice. What happened? The billionaire himself had arrived, his face pale with fear. His eyes darted to his daughter, taking in her soot-covered face and trembling hands before turning to the boy who had saved her. The crowd fell silent, waiting. The boy straightened his shoulders, meeting the billionaire's gaze. He had done the right thing, and no amount of whispered doubt could take that away from him. The boy had never known luxury. His world was one of second-hand clothes, early morning walks to school, and the comforting but familiar sounds of his neighborhood, laughter from kids playing in the streets, the sizzle of food being cooked in small apartments, the occasional blaring of sirens in the distance. His mother worked 2 jobs, coming home late, exhausted, but still managing a smile for him. She always told him that kindness and hard work mattered more than money, that who he was as a person meant more than what he had. And he believed her. Even at just 9 years old, he understood struggle. He spent his afternoons at the community center, helping younger kids with their homework, playing with them so their parents could work without worry. He had always been the one to step up, the one to help, even when no one asked. That was just who he was. So when the billionaire's daughter invited him to her home for the day, he hadn't thought much of it. It wasn't the first time he had been to the mansion. The two had struck up an unlikely friendship, meeting at a public park months ago when she had wandered away from her family's security detail. She had been lonely, tired of the constant supervision, tired of the way people treated her like a fragile thing that couldn't make her own choices. With him, it was different. He didn't care that her father was one of the richest men in the country. He didn't treat her any differently than he would any other kid. They ran, they laughed, they climbed trees and skipped rocks. They were just kids. And so, when she had excitedly invited him to her house again, he hadn't hesitated. He hadn't known that today would change his life forever. The billionaire's family lived in a world of unimaginable wealth. Their estate was more than just a mansion. It was a symbol of power. With sweeping acres of land, private security, and rooms so large they echoed, their home was designed to keep them separate from the world outside. And it had. The billionaire himself had built his empire from the ground up, but in doing so, he had distanced himself from the struggles of the everyday person. His wife, though kind, had been raised in privilege, never having to experience the realities of hardship. Their wealth was a shield, protecting them from ever needing to see what life was like beyond their own circles. But their daughter was different. She had grown up surrounded by luxury, but had never let it define her. Unlike her parents, she saw beyond the walls of their estate, beyond the carefully curated charity events and polished speeches about giving back. She saw people for who they were, not what they had. That was why she had gravitated toward the boy. With him, she wasn't a billionaire's daughter. She was just herself. Their friendship had been innocent, effortless, two kids who simply enjoyed each other's company. She had never seen him as different, never once thought of him as anything less than equal. But not everyone felt the same. There had always been whispers. Staff members who questioned why a boy from his background was allowed into the estate. Guests who raised their eyebrows when they saw him running across the expansive lawn, playing as freely as if he belonged there. He had ignored it, the way he always did, because in the end he had done nothing wrong. And when the fire broke out, when the smoke filled the air and fear overtook the estate, it hadn't mattered where he was from. All that had mattered was that his friend was in danger. He had acted without hesitation, without thought of consequence, because that was who he was. And now, as he stood outside the burning mansion, covered in soot, coughing from the smoke still lingering in his lungs, he was beginning to understand something else. No matter what he did, no matter how much good was in his heart, some people would only ever see him the way they wanted to. The looks, the whispers, the way a few members of the crowd shifted uncomfortably as they eyed him with suspicion. It wasn't enough that he had saved her. They still questioned him. But as the billionaire himself rushed onto the lawn, eyes wild with terror, his gaze locked onto the soot-covered boy standing beside his daughter. And in that moment, everything began to change. The boy had only seconds to react. The fire raged through the second floor, thick black smoke curling through the hallways like a living thing, swallowing up everything in its path. The sharp scent of burning wood filled the air, choking out the oxygen, turning the grand mansion into a death trap. And she was still inside, through the thick haze he saw her, a small, terrified figure near the window, her tiny hands pressing against the glass as if searching for an escape. Flames crawled up the walls behind her, their hungry crackling filling the air. She coughed violently, her tear-streaked face barely visible through the smoke. His feet moved before his brain could think. Ducking past frantic staff and guests who were rushing toward the exits, he ran straight into the fire. "Where are you going?" someone shouted, but he didn't stop. The heat wrapped around him like an unbearable force, his lungs screaming as he pushed forward. He could barely see now, his vision blurred by smoke and sweat, but he didn't need to see. He just needed to get to her. She spotted him through the haze, eyes wide with fear. "I can't get out," she sobbed, her voice hoarse from the smoke. He reached her, grabbing her hand. "Come on." I can't breathe," she whimpered. He scooped her up in his arms, shielding her with his body as he turned back the way he came. His legs burned from the heat, every step heavier than the last. The flames roared louder, closing in. The mansion groaned under the pressure of the fire, beams cracking and collapsing somewhere behind them. He held her tighter. "Almost there," he whispered, though his throat felt raw, his strength beginning to fade. Then, fresh air. The front door burst open as he staggered outside, carrying her into the safety of the open lawn. Cool air rushed over them, his lungs gasping for relief as he dropped to his knees, still holding on to her. For a moment, silence, then murmurs. Low at first, but growing louder. The guests, the staff, the people who had already made it outside, eyes turned toward him, but not all of them were filled with gratitude. A few whispered among themselves, their faces marked with suspicion. Why was he even inside? Did anyone see him before the fire started? Another voice, sharper. What was he even doing in the mansion in the first place? The boy's breath caught in his throat. He had just saved her, pulled her from the flames with his own 2 hands. His arms were still trembling from the weight of carrying her through the fire, his skin smeared with soot, his lungs aching from the smoke he had inhaled. And yet, they still questioned him, like they couldn't believe he had been there for anything but trouble. A lump formed in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't going to give them the reaction they wanted. Instead, he looked at her. She was still clinging to him, her tiny fingers gripping his shirt as though letting go would send her back into the fire. She looked up at the crowd, eyes darting between the accusing faces. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He saved me." The murmurs slowed, some of the doubtful expressions shifting to uncertainty. But not all. Some still eyed him with suspicion, their ingrained prejudice refusing to let them see what was right in front of them. He felt the weight of it pressing down on him, the silent judgment, the quiet accusation that hung in the air like a cloud. But he held his head high, because he knew the truth. He had done the right thing, and no amount of whispers would ever change that. Have you ever been accused or judged unfairly simply because of who you are or where you come from? Have you ever had to prove yourself in a situation where others didn't believe you? Let us know where you're watching from, and what time it is in your area as you reflect on this powerful story. The air was thick with tension. The boy could feel the weight of the stairs pressing down on him, the whispers still floating around, even as he stood with soot-streaked skin, his body aching from the fire's heat. He had risked everything to save her, and yet there were those who still saw him as the problem. But then the billionaire arrived. His expensive shoes crunched against the gravel as he rushed forward, his face pale with fear. His sharp eyes darted between the boy and his daughter, his breaths uneven as he took in the scene before him. His daughter was still clinging to the boy, her small fingers gripping his arm tightly. She looked up, her tear-streaked face breaking into relief the moment she saw her father. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "He saved me." The billionaire knelt, his hands shaking, as he brushed soot from her face. He pulled her into a tight embrace, whispering something only she could hear. When he pulled back, his eyes locked onto the boy. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the billionaire stood up straight and turned to face the crowd. His voice was cold, sharp, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Who here questioned this boy? The crowd fell silent. A few people averted their gazes. Others shuffled their feet, their earlier whispers of doubt suddenly feeling much smaller under the weight of his words. He exhaled sharply, his jaw clenched. I heard the comments, the suspicions, the baseless accusations. His voice rose. This child ran into a burning building to save my daughter, while grown men and women stood outside watching. The boy felt his heart pound in his chest. He hadn't expected this. He had braced himself for more silence, more dismissal. But now, the most powerful man in the room was defending him. The billionaire continued, his voice unwavering. Some of you judged him the moment you saw him. Not because of his actions, but because of who you assumed he was. And yet, none of you had the courage to do what he did. A ripple of discomfort spread through the crowd. The ones who had whispered the loudest just minutes before now shifted uncomfortably under his glare. The billionaire turned back to the boy, his expression softening. "What is your name?" The boy hesitated. "Elijah," he said quietly. "Elijah," the billionaire repeated, as if committing it to memory. He nodded slowly, then spoke the words that would change Elijah's life forever. "My daughter is alive because of you. That is something I can never repay. But what I can do is make sure that your bravery, your kindness, is rewarded the way it deserves to be." The boy blinked, confused. "I don't need anything." The billionaire smiled, shaking his head. "That's exactly why you deserve everything." He turned toward the crowd. "From this day forward, Elijah will have a place at one of the best schools in the country. His education, his future, will be fully covered. Whatever he dreams of, he will have the opportunity to achieve." Gasps echoed through the crowd. A few of the wealthier guests exchanged stunned glances. A scholarship like that? To one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. It was more than a gift, it was a future. But the billionaire wasn't finished. "Elijah," he said, looking back at him, "if you choose to accept, I want you to have mentorship within my business empire. Not because I pity you, not because I see you as a charity case, but because I see potential in you. You acted with courage when others stood still. That is the kind of person who deserves to lead." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say. He had spent his entire life working hard, hoping for a better future, but never expecting something like this. Never expecting someone like the billionaire to see him as anything more than a kid from the other side of town. He glanced at the crowd, at the faces that had doubted him just moments ago. Now, those same people were silent. The whispers had faded, because the truth had been spoken loud enough for all to hear. He wasn't just some kid in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was the one who had saved her. And now, he was the one being lifted into a future greater than he had ever imagined. The boy's life changed in ways he never thought possible. Within days, his family's world shifted. They no longer worried about overdue bills or whether there would be enough food on the table. The billionaire ensured they had everything they needed, not as a handout, but as an investment in their future. His mother, who had spent years juggling multiple jobs just to keep them afloat, was given a stable position within one of the billionaire's companies. For the first time in her life, she could breathe, knowing that her children would have the opportunities she had once only dreamed of. And Elijah? He was about to step into a world he had never imagined for himself. The first day at his new school was overwhelming. The towering gates, the pristine hallways, the students dressed in uniforms that looked like they belonged in a movie. It all felt surreal, but he refused to let himself feel small. He worked harder than ever, pouring himself into his studies, determined to prove that he belonged. But beyond the textbooks and lectures, something even more important was happening. He was growing. Under the billionaire's mentorship, Elijah learned the ins and outs of business, leadership, and decision-making. He sat in meetings, listened to conversations about investments and expansions, and began to see the world through a different lens. At first, the billionaire had seen him as a child who had simply done a good deed. But as the months passed, he saw something deeper, a sharp mind, an undeniable hunger to learn, and a spirit that refused to be broken. The billionaire, once a man who had judged people based on where they came from, now found himself reshaping the very foundation of his empire. He started pushing for change, not just within his company, but in the world around him. He funded scholarships for underprivileged kids, ensuring that Elijah wasn't the last to receive such an opportunity. He built programs aimed at providing real mentorship to young minds who needed guidance, not just financial aid. His business, once an exclusive powerhouse for the elite, began to reflect something new: diversity, inclusivity, and a mission to uplift those who had been overlooked for too long. But for Elijah, the biggest change wasn't in wealth or status. It was in knowing that his story had the power to inspire others. He had once been the kid people doubted, the boy they whispered about, the child whose intentions were questioned even after he had risked his life. Now he was the example that proved them wrong. And as he looked toward the future, standing beside the billionaire who had once underestimated him, he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Years passed, but the memory of that day never faded. Elijah had gone from being a boy judged by whispers to a man defined by his actions. He had defied expectations, proving that true worth wasn't measured by wealth or background, but by heart and character. His story had become an inspiration, one that echoed in classrooms, in boardrooms, and in communities where children like him still faced doubt. He had taken every opportunity given to him and built something greater than anyone had expected. Now, a successful entrepreneur, he had not only mastered the business world but had dedicated his life to creating opportunities for others. Through scholarships, mentorship programs, and leadership initiatives, he ensured that kids from overlooked communities didn't just dream of success. They had the tools to achieve it. The billionaire's family had changed too. What had once been an empire built on exclusivity had transformed into a force for good. The billionaire and his wife had become fierce advocates for diversity, their businesses reflecting a commitment to fairness and equal opportunity. Their foundation supported marginalized communities, and their influence now extended beyond profit. It shaped lives. But the most remarkable thing was the friendship that had endured. Elijah and the billionaire's daughter had remained close, bound not just by the fire that had nearly taken her life, but by a shared vision for the future. They had grown up side by side, learning from each other, changing each other, proving that the barriers society built were never meant to last. And now, as they walked the familiar grounds of the estate where everything had started, the past and the present met in a single moment. The mansion had been rebuilt, but Elijah's eyes were drawn to the spot where it had all happened, the place where he had chosen to act, where his life had shifted in a direction he could have never predicted. He stood there, silent for a moment, then turned to his friend. "You ever think about that day?" he asked. She smiled. "All the time. It was the day everything changed." He nodded, exhaling slowly. "It's not where you start, but where you rise from that matters." She met his gaze, understanding the depth of what he meant. "True change begins with the courage to do what's right," he finished, his voice steady, filled with the certainty of someone who had lived those very words. She linked her arm through his. "And we're just getting started." Together, they walked forward, not just into the estate, but into the future they had helped shape. A future where stories like his weren't rare. A future where no child had to prove their worth simply because of the color of their skin. A future where courage, not prejudice, defined what was possible. And as the sun set over the valley, casting a golden glow over the land, Elijah smiled, because he knew his story was far from over.